In 1967, NHL players voted to form their first union. They needed someone tough, well-connected, and willing to scream at owners. They found Alan Eagleson. For 25 years, they thought he was fighting for them. He wasn't. They didn't call him corrupt. They didn't call him a thief. They called him the most powerful man in hockey, and every player in the league was paying him to rob them. Trust became the weapon. Eagleson didn't start with a union. He started with one phone call. In 1966, an 18-year-old defenseman from Parry Sound was the most coveted prospect in hockey. Bobby Orr had been the property of the Boston Bruins since he was 14, the way the system worked back then. The team owned you before you could shave. When it came time to sign his first NHL contract, Orr's father did something nobody had done before. He hired a lawyer. That lawyer was Alan Eagleson. What Eagleson got from Orr was unheard of. A 2-year deal worth about $75,000 with a signing bonus. More money than any rookie had ever seen. Bruins management was furious. The other 5 teams in the league were nervous. And every player from Detroit to Toronto suddenly wanted to know who this guy was. He was a Toronto lawyer with political ambitions. A sitting member of the Ontario provincial legislature. Loud, funny, well-connected, and willing to scream at owners in a sport where players had spent decades being told to be grateful. Within a year of signing Orr, Eagleson was the most sought-after agent in hockey. He used that leverage immediately. In June of 1967, player representatives from all 6 NHL teams met in Montreal. The first attempt at a players' union, back in 1957, had been crushed by the owners within a year. The players knew they needed someone with legal training, political instincts, and a star client to back them. They voted Bob Pulford as president. They appointed Eagleson as executive director. He was now the agent for the league's best player and the head of the league's union. Nobody in the room thought that was a problem. Most of them couldn't read their own contracts. 5 years later, he became something bigger than a union boss. He became a national hero. The 1972 Summit Series between Canada and the Soviet Union wasn't just a hockey tournament. It was a Cold War theater played on ice. Eagleson organized it, ran it, controlled the player roster, controlled the broadcast rights, and controlled the money. Earlier in Game 8, when Ivan Cornway scored to tie the game and the Soviet goal judge refused to light the lamp, Eagleson tried to storm the timers bench from the stands. Soviet soldiers grabbed him. Canadian players led by Peter Mahovlich charged over the boards to free him, and as they escorted him across the ice to the Canadian bench, he gave the finger to the Soviet crowd. It became one of the most famous images in Canadian sports history. From that moment on, he owned international hockey. The Canada Cup tournaments, NHL participation in the Olympics, Hockey Canada's negotiation with the Soviets, all of it ran through his office. Players didn't see contracts. They didn't see revenue splits. They saw a check at the end of the tournament and assumed the rest had gone where it was supposed to. It hadn't. But the trust was real. Players loved him. He showed up to weddings, lent money to guys in trouble, and called their mothers on birthdays. Bobby Orr referred to him as a big brother for the better part of a decade. That trust was the asset Eagleson was about to spend. The first thing to understand is the structure. Eagleson wasn't running one scam. He was running maybe a dozen of them at the same time, and they all fed each other. Start with the disability fund. NHL players who suffered career-ending injuries were entitled to insurance payouts through a plan the union administered. The premiums came out of the player paychecks. The claims went through Eagleson's office. Players like former Chicago Blackhawks center Glenn Sharpley and former Philadelphia Flyers defenseman Bob Daly filed for disability after serious injuries and were told the claims had been denied or that they had received whatever was owed. Some got a fraction of what their policies were worth. A few got nothing. The money didn't vanish. It got rerouted. Eagleson had personal financial relationships with the insurance brokers handling NHLPA group policies. He steered union contracts to firms that paid him undisclosed referral fees, then sat on claims to keep payouts low. Players paid inflated premiums for worse coverage and never knew there was a markup. Here's what makes this story different from ordinary corruption. He wasn't just stealing from his clients. He was sitting at the bargaining table representing them while quietly working with the people sitting across from him and billing both sides. NHL President John Ziegler and Chicago Blackhawks owner Bill Wirtz, the chairman of the league's board of governors, were Eagleson's two closest friends in hockey. The three of them ran the sport for nearly 20 years. They drank together, vacationed together, and did business together. Collective bargaining agreements under his leadership locked players into some of the worst contracts in pro sports at the time. Free agency barely existed, pension contributions were minimal, and the escrow system favored owners. And every time the players grumbled, Eagleson had a hand-picked executive committee ready to vote down any challenge. He stacked it with veterans who owed him personal favors or who didn't want to lose their own contract leverage. The Canada Cup money was its own operation. Tournament revenues were funneled through private companies Eagleson controlled. Hockey Canada took a public-facing cut. The NHL got its share. Players got per diems and a participation fee. The rest disappeared into a structure that even the union's own accountants couldn't get a clean look at. Then there was the rink board advertising scheme during international tournaments, where Eagleson sold Dasher board ad space and routed the proceeds through holding companies. There were unauthorized loans of pension fund money to his friends and business associates. There was a luxury apartment in London that the NHLPA had unknowingly footed the bill for. By the early 1980s, millions were flowing through Eagleson's various entities. Players still thought he was working for them. Owners knew exactly what he was and protected him. A real union director would have cost them a fortune. The first cracks came from inside the union. In 1989, two NHL player agents named Rich Winter and Ron Seltzer had been complaining for years that Eagleson was blocking them, ignoring their clients, and running the NHLPA like a personal business. They couldn't get him out alone, so they brought in someone with experience taking down a corrupt sports union boss. Ed Garvey had spent 12 years as the executive director of the NFL Players Association. He'd built that union from nothing into a fighting force, taken the league to court, won the Mackey decision that opened the door to free agency in football. He knew exactly what a clean players association was supposed to look like. Winter and Seltzer hired him to audit Eagleson's NHLPA. What Garvey produced was brutal. A 55-page report delivered to player representatives at a union meeting in Florida in June of 1989. It documented unreviewed travel expenses, dasherboard advertising kickbacks, pension money lent to Eagleson's friends, and the fact that the executive director had no real oversight from anyone. Eagleson should have been finished that day. He wasn't. His executive committee, the same group of veterans he'd stacked for years, voted to keep him in place. Eagleson promised to clean things up, hired an outside firm to do a friendly review, and went back to running everything exactly as before. What he didn't know was that a sports writer in Massachusetts had just started reading the Garvey report. Russ Conway was the sports editor of the Lawrence Eagle Tribune, a small daily paper north of Boston. He covered the Bruins, knew Orr personally, and had heard rumors for years. The Garvey report gave him a starting point. From June of 1990, he filed Freedom of Information requests, interviewed former players, pulled financial records on Eagleson's companies, and cross-referenced insurance claims with payouts. It took him 15 months. In September of 1991, he published a 5-part series called Cracking the Ice. It laid out, with documentation, almost everything Eagleson had been doing for the previous 20 years. The series was a 1992 Pulitzer Prize finalist for beat reporting. Not a single major Canadian newspaper picked it up. What did pick it up was the FBI. Because Eagleson had used the U.S. mail and U.S. wire systems to move money, ran his insurance fraud, and conduct business with American players, the case fell into U.S. federal jurisdiction. A federal prosecutor named Paul Kelly in the Boston office started building a case using Conway's reporting as a roadmap. The investigation took 3 years. In March of 1994, a Boston grand jury indicted Eagleson on 32 counts, including racketeering, mail fraud, embezzlement, and obstruction of justice. Eagleson refused to set foot in the United States. He stayed in Toronto and called the charges politically motivated. The RCMP, which had been sitting on the file for years, finally laid Canadian charges in December 1996. By that point, the players knew. A 1995 class action lawsuit filed by Dave Forbes, Rick Middleton, Brad Park, Ulf Nielsen, and Doug Smale named the league itself as a defendant. The suit alleged that NHL executives had known what Eagleson was doing for decades and chose not to act because his deals favored the teams. A compliant union boss was worth more to them than player welfare. Orr's involvement was quieter. He had separated from Eagleson back in 1980 after commissioning his own audits, which revealed that despite earning what should have been generational money in Boston and Chicago, he was effectively broke. The Boston offer Eagleson had hidden from him in 1976, which included an 18.6% ownership stake in the Bruins, would have made him one of the wealthiest athletes of his generation. He retired with almost nothing. He stayed out of the press for years, but his cooperation with American investigators was decisive. The Canadian and American cases ran on parallel tracks for nearly 4 years. Eagleson's lawyers fought extradition for years. They argued that the FBI had no business in a Canadian labor dispute, that the charges were duplicative, that the math should be on their side. It wasn't. The U.S. federal sentencing guidelines for the charges he was facing recommended 41 to 51 months in an American prison. He took the deal. On January 6, 1998, in a Boston federal courtroom, Alan Eagleson pleaded guilty to 3 counts of mail fraud. The room was full of players he had represented and stolen from: Bobby Orr, Brad Park, Ted Lindsay. The fine was approximately $700,000 US, roughly 1 million Canadian. The next day in Toronto, he pleaded guilty to 3 more counts of fraud in a Canadian court and was sentenced to 18 months in a provincial prison. Under Canadian sentencing rules, he was eligible for parole in 6 months. He served exactly that. The collateral damage came in waves. The Law Society of Upper Canada disbarred him. He was stripped of his Order of Canada. He was removed from Canada's Sports Hall of Fame. The Hockey Hall of Fame was the one that mattered most to him. He'd been inducted as a builder in 1989. After his guilty plea, Hall of Fame defenseman Brad Park said publicly,
"I challenge the Hall to remove Alan Eagleson. If they do not, I will request to be removed."
Bobby Orr, Gordie Howe, and Ted Lindsay backed him. About 30 former NHL players, including several Hall of Famers, signed on to the campaign and planned a vigil. The Hall's board scheduled a vote for March 31st, 1998. Eagleson resigned 6 days before it took place. His plaque was removed from the wall the same day. He's still the only person in any major North American sports Hall of Fame to have left under those circumstances. The civil lawsuit from the retired players, the one that named the NHL as a defendant, was thrown out in August of 1998. A federal judge in Philadelphia ruled that the statute of limitations for civil racketeering claims had already expired because players knew about the allegations back in 1991. The Supreme Court declined to revive it. Roughly 1,000 former players who had hoped to recover what Eagleson and the league had cost them got nothing. The pension shortfalls remained. Gordie Howe, the all-time leader in NHL games played at the time, was reportedly receiving about $13,000 a year in pension benefits in the mid-1980s. Players who had relied on the disability fund he raided spent years fighting injuries alone. The money they were owed had already been spent. The real sentence was never 6 months. It was a structure that had been allowed to exist. A union boss who could also be a player agent, private corporations running public tournaments, insurance contracts with no independent review, a pension fund with no outside oversight. None of it required new laws to fix. It required players willing to read the documents they'd been signing for 25 years and demand someone explain them. That didn't happen because Eagleson went to prison. It happened because Bob Goodenow, the lawyer who replaced him at the NHLPA in 1992, walked into the office, ordered a full audit, and refused to let the executive committee bury it. Within 3 years, average player salaries had more than doubled. Within 5, they'd tripled. The money had been there the entire time. it had just been going somewhere else. Eagleson kept his pension. He still lives in Toronto. The men he stole from spent decades trying to recover what was already gone, and most of them never did. Hockey moved on. He didn't have to. Drop a comment and tell me, should a guy like that ever be allowed to keep a single dollar from the sport he robbed? I read every reply. If this one hit, joining the membership is the best way to keep these coming. And hit subscribe. The next story I'm telling is one most people have never heard.